First, let me apologize for that that long introduction. We've got to edit that down. I know many of you, it's good to at least virtually see you all. Fred, Chris, Mitch, everybody, thanks for having me today. What I'm going to talk about is a study we did for a university in Sault Ste. Marie, and it's not quite a higher education study. And so really the take-home message, if you don't want to sit through the next 20 slides, is that when you think about these, you really have to disaggregate these non-traditional studies into subsets of what they actually do. First and foremost, I'm with the W. Upjohn Institute. For those of you who don't know us, we're an outside the Beltway think tank located in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We work with everybody from small towns to states to energy companies to the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. So we have been users of REMI for, I guess, close to 30 years. Me personally, about 25 years. This year we upgraded to a 25 region model so we could look at every workforce investment region within the state of Michigan. So the project that we're looking at is at Lake Superior State University, is a new freshwater center, a research center that also serves an academic purpose, a visitor purpose, and other things. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. The intent of the study was to help secure CARES and other current dollars from the Economic Development Administration, which is part of Department of Commerce. So this is one of those things that those of you who do economic development, economic impacts, probably do regularly. It's a very traditional EDA type of a study. Again, the intent of the study is to, the intent of the building is to create a research center at a university that studies freshwater, and so a bit unique in its roles. The maybe interesting thing about this is that it is located in the 3 counties of the upper peninsula of Michigan. So while the jobs may not seem large, they are really important in places like that. It's a very rural, very remote place, the 3 counties, and so this is very important. And I'll go into the detailed costs and the detailed outcomes and talk about how I thought about it. But the estimated costs of construction are about $14.2 million for both horizontal and vertical construction. So everything from putting the building in the dirt, site prep, roads, electrical, other infrastructure. We had to condense because of the nature of things already happening, and backcasting, as you know, gets a bit tricky sometimes. We condensed all of the construction activities, which actually spanned about 24 months, into about 12 months, but felt because much of it was contracted out, so some of the soft costs like engineering and architecture and others were actually not located within the region, that this was something we could do. And then we looked at 10 years of operations. The trick of the operations component was there just wasn't a good set of pro formas, so we had to work with the client and other interested parties within the region to try and identify and determine reasonable inputs and escalation of those, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Again, the project straddles functions as a research center, but also is a teaching location, and has impacts to the community as well as visitor impacts, but not in the traditional way. And again, I'll speak about that more in a moment. So here's the study region. You may know where Sault Ste. Marie is. It borders on the Canadian border, and is in the northern part of Michigan, above what we lovingly here call the Mitten, but it's the 3 counties to the eastern part of the UP. So there are multiple components to this project, but it's not a complete university. So just trying to think of this as a traditional higher ed study really doesn't work very well. The first component of this is again, centers on construction. So there was land acquisition, so we were able to tweak some areas in the land real estate leasing area. There was site prep and infrastructure, and if you know the detailed inputs in the construction areas, we were able to tweak those. There were soft costs, so we went into some professional and technical services and tweaked those a little bit. But the interesting thing, and this is the first time I encountered this, the university actually had their own staff overseeing aspects of this. So we did actually have a university FTE that we put into this. So it did kind of go into higher ed, and that may be debatable way that possibly it should have gone into professional services. A bit of the unusual build out in looking at a higher ed building is there was about $1.5 million of lab equipment that we had to identify and deal with. And then over the 10 years, there were center operations plus other areas that I'll talk about in the next few slides. So why isn't this a simple higher ed study? Again, there was construction, there was operations in a day-to-day situation, much like you would manage or operate any commercial, industrial, flex office building. There were academic components to this where teaching was happening, and so there were students involved, but much like a traditional academic study, we had to think about what was the off-campus aspects of student spending, because we'd already accounted for the student aspects of being on campus within operations as a higher ed institution. Then research was a bit unusual because not only were there funded researchers kind of on staff as FTEs, they also had a significant proportion of visiting scholars, because this building was built on the shores of, I believe it was Lake Superior. And so people were actually coming in for long periods in the summer to work on projects within the building, but also off-site and within the region. And so this is a bit different than a traditional research question. We're working currently with the Western Michigan University Med School. Their researchers tend to be on-site kind of 12 months a year. So in this case, we had both funded research internal to the system, but also with visiting scholars, and with them came not only revenues, but also visitor expenditures. And then there's also a visitor component to this system. And so while in most cases, higher ed folks look at visitors, those folks, and if you're thinking about University of Michigan, at least in more traditional years, lots of people come to campus for Parents' Weekend, for football games, basketball games, and other things. The visitors that would be coming to the center aren't coming to the university. They're often visiting the area, going to the Sioux Locks and other attractions. And it's thought that this will be an interesting center where people can bring their families, where there's a lot of interactive sorts of things. So visitors were much more like a recreational amenity than they were the traditional visitors to a higher ed facility. So again, I mentioned that we modeled this over 11 years. The first year was entirely based on construction, and then years 2 through 11, so those 10 years were operations. And the interesting thing, of course, is there's never a good pro forma, there's never good data. But so we used a series of escalators, and we went back and forth with the client. And I think that's one of the most important things as you do these, is that you get, with any client you're working with, you do your best to agree on things, talk to people. We talked to the people from the planning district and others to see if our assumptions made sense. Did they pass the sniff test as we were putting these into models? Because keeping in mind that you're escalating the outcomes of this study to an EDA project, to an EDA application for funds, and so you want to keep your position defensible should you be called into this. So again, we escalated center staff growing from 16 to 35 from year 1 to year 10. Grants to the university were initially about $2.7 million for research with 4 scientists and staff. And then by year 10, thought that had not quite doubled, but also had $4.3 million in grants, and moving from 4 to 10 scientists on site. Year 1 visitors were estimated to be at about 15,000 and expected to grow, oh, sorry for the typo there, to 75,000 by year 10. This is based on experience in the Eastern UP, again, for the Sioux Locks and other destination amenities. And they thought that this would be as interesting. And again, this building was located not on campus, but off campus, near the water, in a park district, and others. And there was thought that the students would grow from 25 in year 1 to 300 by year 10, because this research center and Lake Superior State is one of the premier places for doing freshwater research in the country. And of course, each of those students is unlikely to come from within the 3 counties of the Eastern UP. So this sort of negates the substitution effect that we're always sensitive to by by these students bringing lots of money into the footprint. So what all did we look at? And so here's the very detailed budget. Again, you know, for 14.2 million, we put that into higher ed buildings in the construction sector. Road to the center, that was, of course, in the, and I forget the exact term, but highways, roads, and bridges in the model. Land purchase went into real estate. Of course, the early architecture went into professional, scientific, and technical services. Centers, personnel time went into higher ed because they were higher ed employees. It was one person. Center staffing went into higher education. And then again, you've got to break down how these things play out, because this is a non-traditional university. We had visiting scientist nights where we looked at federal per diems and applied those to the number of nights. And again, using just a regular escalator, we went from 480 nights to 1,200 nights. And when we put those into the model for spending on everything from food, accommodations, retail, transportation, and other things, we were able to use we agreed on using federal per diem rates, since many of these folks are either federal researchers or state researchers, and so likely subject to that. Visitor spending, that was a little trickier. We didn't have great data there, but we escalated it up and caveated it within the study. Again, the number of new students, and we assumed that all of those students were not from the region. Probably some of them are, but it dealt with some of the substitution effect. We're able to look at salary and fringes with this 10 students, supplies, equipment, travel, and then there were some in-kind things that they got, like the heat from the Cloverland Electric Co-op, and then also from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. So those were in-kind types of things that we wanted to be sure we looked at. And if you're wondering, what did the Michigan Department of Natural Resources supply food and service to? In fact, one of the things that the freshwater folks do at Lake Superior State is develop all of the salmon fingerlings for distribution throughout the state. And this was, while the actual running of the hatchery was embedded in the university, these were benefits that came from the state to keep the hatchery going. So what did we get out of REMI? You know, of course, what everybody's always interested in, every elected and appointed, is how many jobs does this create? And that's also what EDA is interested in. So through the construction cycle, we started at total employment, including public sector employment, at just about 202 jobs. First year of operations, about 65 jobs. And by year 11, with visitors and scholars and research dollars and everything else, we got up to just slightly over 267 jobs. It added, and these dollars are in thousands, so the construction, again, was 14.2, but added about $14.9 million in gross domestic product to the region. Again, REMI was correctly sensitive to how much is locally supplied, and in the case of much of what you saw in the Eastern UP, much of it was not able to be supplied locally, particularly professional, scientific, and technical services. Year 2, about $5.3 million in the economy, going up to almost $21 million in year 11. Output and sales, which is what's often most important in a region, is about $26 million in output. And then year 1 of operations from 8.5 million up to about 32 million. And then maybe really the most important thing in looking at job creation, and this is something that EDA is interested in, over the life cycle of this, it actually creates sustainable income in the region of $3 million, and using REMI, and these are in nominal dollars, to $15.7 million. So what are the dilemmas and challenges in creating these type of estimates? Well, again, we had to take the build cost and build to a single year. Costs are best estimated using regional federal per diem rates. That may be correct, it may not, but it's part of the challenge. Visitors were based on experience at other Eastern UP attractions. And so in many ways, these are our best guesses. And that's the problem, particularly 10 years out, when you're looking at this, is finding reasonable escalators that people are willing to buy into and agree upon. Substitution effect is always tricky with academic places. How many of the students, and we really thought it was relatively small because it's a low population area, but there would be a lot of natural interest in the ecology and other aspects of the Lake Superior State. And then also, interestingly enough, working with these folks, it's often difficult to explain the substitution effect and why you don't use everything. And so it was challenging. As with many of these EDA projects, they spring up very quickly, and so estimating student spending got a little murky, and of course, they have some information, but we were really looking at the off-campus spending and those sorts of things. And we didn't have time, we only had probably a month or less than a month to help support this EDA application. So we couldn't survey students. So again, they were our best guess, best estimates, working with the student services folks at Lake Superior State. What we don't know is, and we used a pre-COVID model for this because this was relatively middle of Q2, and we started this fairly early in Q2 of this year. And so we don't know how the evolving baselines will be as we've looked at Michigan, as we've looked at the national Michigan, and then some of the regional forecasts we see from Gabe Ehrlich, who you heard on Wednesday, their forecast in CBO Incorporated. And this does suggest a rebound in the Michigan economy by 2027. But we don't know what the implications will be. What we are seeing in Michigan is a lot more intra-state travel. So as this system becomes online, people are going to places, camping with RVs and others, much more into the universities, into the UP. Other things we created impact estimates for each of those categorical areas that we talked about, and then one combined, so they could see where the impacts were as they looked at developing this out and as they marketed for visitors and other things. Of course, nobody ever has enough time or money to create these estimates. So we end up doing our best at the Institute to support different folks with these types of requests. We had a great client. They were really sharp. They had great contacts within the region. And that's really important as you do this and you try to the best of your ability, try and talk through things and agree on things. We've done studies for everybody from the Cleveland Indians to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And of course, can't tell you how many times people will say, well, that was a bought and paid for study. So by using lots of documentation, we don't look like a bought and paid for study. We try to be, particularly coming from the Institute, make sure that we have as a reliable set of data inputs. We use REMI very intentionally. We have and will continue. As I mentioned, we just made an investment this year to go from 12 to 25 regions. And so because people use this as part of a justification for funding, documentation, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and others as a defense and grant applications is really important because your name gets on it. And so being careful, having a great client, having regional partners that can help you with this, but also by thinking about not just boilerplating this. One of the things that we struggle with here is we tend to do one-offs like this, and so we don't do 50 of these a year. And my prior boss, the president, would say, well, why don't we get more work around these things? It's like, and I said, because we're very customized in what we do. And so while higher ed questions are often somewhat relatively rote, we're also working with a med school I mentioned. A med school is much like this. It's part university, part hospital, part research, part visitors, part students. And so as you look at these, look at each one as its own entity and think about what are the disaggregated parts that you use, rather than the easy thing for us would have been put $14.2 million in, put some numbers into the higher ed component and kicked it out. But we felt that that wouldn't be legitimate, that we really need to think about what goes into the study and how you break that study down into its component parts. So thanks. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and glad, along with my prior presenter, who I enjoyed a great deal, to answer any questions. So thanks so much. Let me turn it back to you, Ian.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robey. And yes,